Good evening and welcome. Good evening, and if we can get your attention to get started, wonderful. Good evening and welcome to the first annual Green Lecture on Faith, Race, and Community. My name is Kasey Stevens. I'm the director of the Phelps Scholars Program here at Hope College. And thank you all for being here. About a week ago, we were nervous about publicity. So we're very grateful, truly, to have each of you here with us. This evening is co-sponsored by the Phelps Scholars Program as well as the American Ethnic Studies Program at Hope College. And so we're very grateful and thrilled to be here with Professor Green at this evening's lecture. Tonight, we will hear from Professor Charles Green, Dr. Charles Green, on what it means to get race right. And at least, I think a quick glance at articles, headlines, book titles might reveal that we need clarity, if not correction, on this topic. A closer look might reveal that there's certainly some concern about maybe unheard or unreported versions of history or different topics and narratives that have been neglected or underrepresented over time. I think a more intimate connection to this topic would probably reveal a deep level of pain for those that have been affected by racism. It would most likely reveal as well some intimate connections that we hold for those of us that have been oppressed by others. It might reveal some complicity of potentially ourselves, of the church, of our system, of our government. And those things are worth exploring because we have a God who has a different intention for the way that creation experiences life and has the opportunity to live life. And for those reasons, this topic is very relevant. We also have a God who provides us, I believe, with prophetic, wise, informed, and scholarly leaders and experts on this topic. And I think that we have one of those people here with us this evening with Dr. Green. And so to introduce tonight's lecture, we have Emily Salazar, a 2019 alumnus of Hope College and of the Phelps Scholars Program. Welcome, Emily.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Salazar, and as you said, I am an alumna of Hope College, class of 2019, and tonight I'll be introducing our speaker for tonight. Dr. Charles Green is a social psychologist with his PhD from the University of Florida and is also a distinguished member of the Hope community. In his 37 years here, he has served as the director of the Frost Research Center, a director of the Phelps Scholars Program, and as one of my favorite professors. I always have and always will recommend taking a class with Dr. Green, especially his Race in America course. Out of all the courses I've taken here at Hope, that is the one class that's left the most impact on me and will be things that, truthfully, I'll be using what I've learned from that class for the rest of my life. Dr. Green pours knowledge and wisdom into each and every one of his students, and he's taught me so much about cultural competence. Plus, he never fails to make us laugh with his witty sarcasm. Dr. Green was honored at my commencement as the Hope Outstanding Professor Educator of the Year, and for good reason. He is caring, wise, and trustworthy. He takes the time to truly listen and understand people, and he goes the extra mile for each and every one of his students. Sometimes, for example, I send him frantic emails asking for help about my future, and he'll take the time to send a page-long email addressing all of my concerns, my list of concerns, and along with some encouraging and calming words, much needed encouraging and calming words. He continues to go the extra mile even for students who have already graduated. He is a phenomenal professor, my personal mentor, and an amazing person overall. Without further ado, here's your speaker for tonight, Dr. Green.
Thank you, Emily. How kind. The slides worked great for 2 hours, right up until 7:05. So we're going to get them back here. But because we're starting late, I'm going to get started. So we're going to catch up with the slides in just a bit. So thank you for coming out. There's so many things you could be doing with your time. and I don't take your time for granted. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank David Cho, who created this lecture series and invited me to give this talk. Kasey Stevens, our new Phelps Scholars Program director, and all of the work that he has done. Jordan Hill, the Scott Hall RD, who has helped with the publicity. Andrea Coe, my amazing TA, who helped me with the slides. And after the presentation, there will be a Q&A with our panelists, Professors Llena Chavis, Jesus Montaño, Amy Otis, and Kasey Stevens. So if you want to talk with me in a little greater depth, you can email me, but I want them to have a chance to answer your questions and for you to hear from a variety of voices. I recently learned about land acknowledgments from Loa Beebe and Chip Caldwell. I never thought much about whose land I lived on until about 10 years ago when I had the opportunity to work on a series of Holland powwows. One of the people in that group, Dan Cornelison, was a member of the Matchabenashuish Band of Potawatomi Indians, and he had a literal dream of bringing a powwow to Hope College as a gift of reconciliation to the white settlers for taking their land. Right? I can't get started like this. I gotta wait. I gotta build up to this. Okay. So that moves me very deeply. And so we're going to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement as our invocation. We respectfully acknowledge that we meet tonight on the traditional land of the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and other Anishinaabe people who were forced to relocate when white settlers moved into this area in the mid-19th century. We recognize, too, the continuing presence of the Anishinaabe on this land and their unique and enduring relationship with their traditional territories. Thank you. So I'm going to do my best tonight to offer preliminary answers to 4 questions about getting race right. How did we end up here? What exactly is going on? Where's the church, anyway? And what can we do now? So let's get started. Our grandson turned 4 recently. Everybody should have a 4-year-old grandson. If you don't have a 4-year-old grandson, you need to get on that. He got a birthday crown at preschool. It's a Spanish immersion school, and so his crown said, Feliz cumpleaños, and I started to sing Feliz cumpleaños to him. And he got this quizzical look on his face, and he cocked his head, and he said, Grandpa, do you go to preschool? He was surprised because to him, Spanish is something that happens at preschool, right? It's like snack time and recess. And if Grandpa knows Feliz cumpleaños, then Grandpa must go to preschool, right? And Charlie's question reminds us that we all live in and are bounded by a particular context. I studied race for many years before I stopped to ask, where did the concept come from? And how long has it been around? And what does it look like in other countries? One of the heroes of our age, Bryan Stevenson, director of the Equal Justice Initiative, has spent a lifetime working on behalf of innocent people on death row. He captured the essence of our racial history in this passage from his powerful memoir, Just Mercy. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude or forced labor. I believe the real evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy that we made up to legitimate the enslavement of black people. Black people are different than white people. They can't do this. They can't do that. And that narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white supremacy, that is the true evil of American slavery. This is a profound truth and the key to understanding how we got to where we are. Anthropologists tell us that the concept of race is fundamentally meaningless. In fact, the American Anthropological Association uses the word race in quotation marks to signal that the word does not mean what we think it means. We know we're all Africans originally, and that only a subset of Africans migrated out to populate the rest of the globe. And that's why there's significantly more genetic variability within Africa than in all the rest of the world combined. And we know from research done by Keith Chang and others that the relatively recent mutation of a single gene led to the development of light-colored skin in Europe. Light skin is adaptive in dark climates because it helps us absorb enough sunlight to produce vitamin C. There are a few superficial things, skin color, hair, eyelids, that are different on average from continent to continent. But in all of anthropology, nothing maps onto our understanding of race. Nothing explains the power of race. Nothing tells us why the fundamental division in our society is race, in income, education, health, wealth, attitudes, faith, and so much more. So, how did race, which is meaningless anthropologically, come to define so much of life in the US and around the world? I've got this cough I can't shake, so you should be patient, please. In 1948, sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox, a Trinidadian immigrant to the US, published a classic work, Caste, Class, and Race, in which he argued that the ideology of race as we understand it had its origins in European colonialism. Now let's be clear about colonialism. It was much less about pious pilgrims in search of religious freedom and much more about the search for gold, land, and other riches, whatever the cost. And the costs were high. Large-scale genocide of indigenous Americans began in 1493 on Columbus's second voyage. The first enslaved Africans were brought west only 8 years later in 1501. Over the next 4 centuries, Europeans colonized all or part of every nation on the planet with 4 exceptions: Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Liberia. Christian pastor and Native American activist Mark Charles has taught many of us about the doctrine of discovery, a series of 15th century papal bulls that blessed European colonization, gave permission to invade non-Christian nations, enslaved the people, and extract the gold. Millions died. Millions were subjected to one of the most brutal forms of slavery in all of history. Colonization was horrific, but exploitation pays well, and it made Europeans fabulously wealthy all across the globe. In the US in the early 19th century, half of our national GDP was connected to slavery, right? Cotton in South Carolina, but also textile mills in Massachusetts, and shipyards in Rhode Island, and ports in New York City. But even with the official blessing of the church, there was still the question of the brutality. How could that be justified by people who, like many of us here this evening, saw themselves as good Christians? The answer lay in demeaning and dehumanizing the colonized. If Indians were less human than Europeans, then stealing their land and killing them off could be justified. If Africans were less human than Europeans, then their enslavement could be justified. Better yet, if Europeans could conclude that Africans were well suited to slavery, they could believe that they were acting in accordance with a divine plan for Africans' earthly improvement and heavenly salvation. Lazy people need the discipline of slavery. Rhythmic, athletic people can work long hours in the hot sun. Childish, violent people need to be controlled for their own good and the benefit of others. The stereotypes that white people have, dang it, I'm not going to do this all night. The stereotypes that white people have of black people today find their origins in the tortured justifications for slavery 350 years ago. So here's the syllogism. It's the Enlightenment, right? All men are created equal. Some, however, are obviously not equal. Therefore, they must not fully be men. As Enlightenment philosopher Baron de Montesquieu wrote, sarcastically, it is impossible for us to suppose these creatures to be men, because allowing them to be men, a suspicion would follow that we ourselves are not Christians. In other words, it's difficult to forgive the people who have wronged us. It's almost impossible to forgive the people we have wronged. Race did not lead to racism. Racism led to the concept of race. In order to deny their own inhumanity, colonizers denied the humanity of others instead. The concept of race is itself a racist assertion, a justification of white supremacy. Everything else flows from there. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes this in his brilliant book, Between the World and Me. Americans believe in the reality of race as a feature of the natural world. Racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature, and one is left to deplore the Middle Passage or the Trail of Tears the way one deplores an earthquake or a tornado or any other phenomenon that can be cast as beyond the handiwork of man. But race is the child of racism, not the father. It has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy, so much as one of hierarchy. Difference in hue and hair is old, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society and that they signify deeper attributes, this is the new idea at the heart of these new people who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. Yale theologian and Calvin College graduate Willie James Jennings describes the role of the church in creating racism and race. Our racial struggles are intractable because we refuse to see how deeply their roots are embedded in the way we think, live, and imagine the world. Race in America is a form of religious faith. Indeed, race has a Christian architecture, and Christianity in the West has a racial architecture. Dr. Jennings also helps us see how white dominance inevitably becomes white identity. Whiteness is a way of imagining oneself as part of the central facilitating reality, the reality that makes sense of, interprets, organizes, and narrates the world. Whiteness is having the power to realize and sustain that imagination. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, author of Reconstructing the Gospel, Finding Freedom from Slaveholder Religion, writes about this idolatrous worship of our own whiteness by saying that white American Christians are living in skin. Grandpa, did you go to preschool? Exploitation is a ravenous beast, and it demands continual feeding. Pushing Indians west of the Appalachians, then west of the Mississippi, then on to smaller and smaller bits of land that were reserved for their use. It took a civil war and 600,000 lives to end slavery, a huge step forward. Reconstruction, however, lasted about a week and a half, followed by a violent backlash, every bit as consequential as the war itself. A century of Jim Crow in both its southern and its northern incarnations. Jim Crow went way beyond segregation of public facilities. There were lynchings, race riots, meaning white people looting and murdering black people in their neighborhoods. Voter suppression, using prisoners as enslaved laborers, the Klan, offering land out west only to white settlers, redlining, restricting GI benefits to white soldiers, and on and on and on. Professor James Q. Wilson of the Yale Law School read the minutes of the meetings in which the Nazis created the Nuremberg laws that restricted Jewish life in Germany in the 1930s. In those minutes, the Nazis praised Jim Crow law and practice as an excellent model. Manifest destiny, race-based immigration policies, anti-miscegenation laws, denial of citizenship to Native Americans, all these and more inspired the Nazis in many ways. Their stated goal in these minutes was to treat the Jews the way the U.S. treated its ethnic minorities. Harvard philosopher Cornel West says that Jim Crow was neo-slavery. He calls segregation the deodorized term for a century of terror, hatred, and trauma fueled by greed. Jim Crow was the backlash to emancipation, a way to maintain white supremacy enforced by violence, just like the genocide and the slavery that came before. Why does this matter today? Because the flip side of brutality against people of color was opportunity for people who were white, as explained by historian Ira Katznelson in his book, When Affirmative Action Was White. Most white people today, not just those we consider wealthy, continue to benefit from Jim Crow policies. Let me tell you how that has worked for one typical middle-class white American. My forebears entered this country at a time when only Europeans were allowed to come. Some of them faced hardships, but they were here. One of my forebears homesteaded a farm in Kansas on land seized from Indians by the government. Only white people could do that. Imagine the difference today if either Indians had been allowed to keep their lands or newly freed black slaves had been able to take advantage of that opportunity as well. A few generations later, my family found oil on that farm. Not a lot. But it enabled my grandparents to buy a house and start living a middle-class life. When my dad came back from the Korean War, he could not find a job. And so for default, he signed up for the GI Bill and went to college, something he'd never thought about doing before. It was a huge benefit for white male veterans only. And I grew up my whole life believing that college was possible for me. All my grandparents retired on Social Security. That doesn't sound remarkable, unless you know that most people of color in their generation weren't eligible for Social Security. Farmhands and domestic servants weren't allowed to sign up. And this was done specifically to keep most Black Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans out of the program. When my wife and I bought a house 35 years ago, my grandparents loaned us the money. Okay. So 1940s oil money from an 1870s homestead becomes a 1980s mortgage, and we still live in that house. My wife and I have lived a stable middle-class life because our forebears were white. They worked very hard, but millions of others worked just as hard without the opportunity to turn that work into financial stability. 350 years of legal discrimination provided me with significant advantage, and the legacy continues with my adult children. Of course, the white majority doesn't acknowledge the cumulative effects of all this advantage. Check out the Wikipedia page on the history of Holland, Michigan, which simply says that Van Raalte and his colony settled on land, get this, in the midst of the Odawa people. Turns out that joint occupation by the two communities was not a marriage made in heaven, and thus the Odawa simply decided to move north. Right? The white version of history of race in this country is a toxic mixture of denial and justification. Nothing much happened, and besides, they deserved it. Things did change in the 1960s. The civil rights movement was the next big step forward, thanks to thousands of courageous people. But look at what followed. Hostile Supreme Court rulings, dog whistle politics, and millions of white people who fought to preserve and strengthen the exclusionary walls around white neighborhoods, churches, and schools. The backlash to the civil rights movement, by the way, was national, not regional. History and current events show that racism runs deep throughout the nation. I make no apology for Southern racism, but the Northern obsession with Southern forms of racism serves mostly to help white Northerners ignore their own racist beliefs and practices. Even early on, white opposition to the civil rights movement was nationwide. This is not Charlotte. This is Chicago. This is not Detroit, or this is not Dallas, it is Detroit. This is not New Orleans, this is New York, not Florida, Philadelphia, and not Louisville, LA. Right. The Equal Justice Initiative reports that Southern opponents of integration were strongly encouraged by the fan mail they received from all over the country. To know that so many Northerners were supportive was a source of great encouragement to them. Ibram X. Kendi, historian and director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University, helps us put all this in perspective in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Our national narrative about race says that things started off bad, but we've made slow, steady progress ever since. Kendi argues that things have gotten better, and they've also gotten worse. He argues that both racism and anti-racism have marched through our history together, constantly dueling, and that the fight itself is what defines us. Things did start off bad, and then they did get better. We made some anti-racist progress, but then there was racist backlash to the anti-racist progress. And in the civil rights movement, there was anti-racist backlash to the racist progress, right? And it's the dialectic between racism and anti-racism that is the real narrative. We often hear our own time referred to as the post-civil rights era. Following Kendi's description of our historical cycle, anti-racist progress, racist backlash, it would be more accurate to say that we live in the era of the backlash to civil rights. For 50 years now, millions of people, many with access to great power and resources, have been working tirelessly to blunt the successes of the civil rights movement, to turn back the clock, to do so quietly when possible, but with intimidation and violence when necessary. All over the country today, well-meaning white people are asking, often indignantly, how can all this be happening? This is 2019. That's because they think they've been living in the post-civil rights era. People of color, however, understand they have been living in the post-civil rights backlash era because they have been living the backlash. They, and some white people who are paying attention, are not surprised by the prevalence of racism in 2019. They know that the backlash has spent half a century. The backlash has spent half a century to get us precisely to this point. Poet Lucille Clifton puts it like this. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. So what gives racism its longevity? What gives racism its power? Racialization, as defined by sociologist Michael W. Emerson and Christian Smith in Divided by Faith. Racialization is the fact that race matters profoundly for differences in life experience, life opportunities, and social relationships. When I said earlier that race is the fundamental division in our society, the one that predicts the most about our income, education, wealth, health, attitudes, faith, and so on, that's racialization. And this is Emerson and Smith's definition of racism. Pay attention, this is key. A changing ideology with the constant and rational purpose of perpetuating and justifying a social system that is racialized. This is in part Bryan Stevenson's narrative of racial difference. Black people can't do this, black people can't do that, plus a healthy dose of blaming the victim. It fits exactly with the idea that racism created race, but it explains as well the fact that anti-racist progress is followed inevitably by racist backlash. Racialization is the work we do to make sure white people get a better deal than anybody else. It's the time and energy required to keep white supremacy supreme. Racism is the explanation we give ourselves and others to explain and explain away racialization. Maintaining racialization and justifying it with racism is what colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, and the current backlash are all about. Comedian Amar Rahman explains it like this.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amar. Hey. Get on stage. You make your jokes about white people. You say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Amar. You do that. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun 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 reverse racism? I said no. I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out, there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism, and I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. The white people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture's inferior, and then, just for kicks, subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.
Well, thank you. You've been great. Good night.
And that's how we ended up here. So what exactly is going on now? Our current situation can be quite disorienting. The ferocity of all this nasty racism all the time is an assault on the senses. We see the bits and the pieces, and we feel the sorrow and the anger. But understanding the big picture is hard. So let's draw the lines from our history to our present in a few key areas. Remember, racialization is the unjust allocation of resources to the benefit of white people. Racism is the justification of racialization. They work hand in hand, but for the purposes of analysis, let's consider them separately, beginning with racialization. Let's start with income. You won't be surprised to know that black and Latino families make only about 60% of the income of white families on average. That really adds up over the years. For people born in the early 1950s, right about retirement age now, the racial ethnic differences in their lifetime earnings are quite large, especially for men. White men made nearly $1 million more across their career than black and Latino men. If you're black or Latino, imagine making $1 million more. If you're white, imagine making $1 million less. Why the disparity? Deva Pager and others have shown time and again that a resume with a white-sounding name still elicits far more requests for a callback interview than an identical resume with a black or Latino-sounding name. You can see here in an early study that white applications with a criminal record had slightly more callbacks than black applications with no criminal record. Being black has the same effect on a stellar job application as serving time for a felony. A plurality of white people in this country believe that whites face more discrimination than people of color in the job market. But there is zero research support for that absurd notion. Thank you for catching. Yes, get a point. Wealth. Let's look at your wealth. Your assets minus your debts. Wealth is even more important than income and more indicative of family financial history because, as my life story shows, much of our wealth is passed from one generation to another. The Census Bureau reported last week that inequality, wealth inequality, is higher now in this country than at any time since they started measuring it in 1967. And there is a huge race gap. Studies consistently show that black and Latino families have 5 to 10% of the wealth of white families. Not 5 to 10% less, 5 to 10% as much. And the gap is growing. See how black and Latino wealth is up only slightly in 2016 dollars, while white wealth has gone up quite a bit. Folks, this is way more than money. This is a home. This is a retirement. This is sending your kids to college. Furthermore, the poverty of one's community is as important in determining life opportunities as the poverty of one's family. The Annie E. Kasey Foundation says that nearly half of Native, Black, and Latino children live in high poverty, low opportunity neighborhoods. Even if they are not officially in poverty themselves, they grow up with very few resources or social connections for getting ahead. There's a large disparity by race and ethnicity in health and healthcare. Courtney Cogburn, a member of the social work faculty at Columbia, says this: "Our lived experiences contribute to racial inequalities in health. For the 15 leading causes of death, Blacks have an earlier onset, faster progression, and earlier death than whites, even when we account for education, income, and health insurance. Chicagoans who live in the Streeterville neighborhood, right, Magnificent Mile, Navy Pier, have a life expectancy of 90 years. Chicagoans who live 90 miles south in Inglewood have a life expectancy of 60 years. Economic differences are one important factor, of course, but so is the accumulated stress of racial discrimination, which takes a significant toll on the body. Infant health and maternal health are especially poor for African Americans. The uterus is a blood-rich organ, and stress damages the uterus in much the same way it damages the heart. The result is a significant increase in very low birth weight babies and in mothers who die in childbirth at every level of income and education. Social psychologist Thomas Pettigrew has written that residential segregation is the linchpin of racialization because it makes all other forms possible. Douglas Massey, best known as the co-author of American Apartheid, says that segregation is about as high now as it's ever been before, especially in the Northeast and the Upper Midwest. The one change over the last 50 years is that most white people today are willing to live in a neighborhood with Black or brown families if there are only one or two of them and they meet or exceed community standards for education and income, right? The line has moved from all white to virtually all white if there are only a few of them and they are the right kind of people. And because they're open to living near a very small number of people of color, they believe themselves to be not racist. Same thing in schools. Most white people tell pollsters they favor integrated schools. Most white people select segregated schools for their children. Sociologist Ann Owens says this: once you control for all the other things parents might say they care about, economic class, test scores, resources, etc., white parents still prefer schools serving fewer Black or Hispanic kids. In 1974, white suburban Detroit area families, sued to prevent school desegregation from crossing state lines. They also firebombed a school bus parking lot as part of their protest, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. The message of the court was clear: move to a white area and keep it white. If you can maintain residential segregation, you get to have school segregation too. The White Citizens Council of Dallas County, Alabama circulated this flyer in 1963. What have I done personally to maintain segregation? It's a good question for all of us who are white, frankly. When we look for nice neighborhoods, good schools, a church where we can feel comfortable, let's be honest. What are we really looking for? Let's bring this closer to home. White people around here often talk about living in the West Michigan bubble. Right? But West Michigan is quite diverse and extremely segregated. We talk about living in a bubble because we want to pretend that our segregated lives are some sort of accident beyond our control. There is no bubble. We have self-embubbleated. But we don't want to admit it, especially to ourselves. All this racialization is what theologian James Cone had in mind when he wrote this in Black Theology and Black Power in 1969. I am not prepared to talk seriously with a man who essentially says, I sit on a man's back, choking him, making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I feel very sorry for him and I wish to lighten his load by all possible means. except by getting off his back. So that's a glimpse into our contemporary racialization. What about the racism that justifies and maintains it? There are 4 types I want to call to your attention. The first is public, overt, out there racism, which we have experienced throughout our history, but which has become more visible to many of us in the last decade or so. We see it every day. There are Border Patrol agents with a racist Facebook page. People who dial 911 because a black family is using a grill in a public park. People in restaurants who decide that now would be a great time to walk over to a table of black people and call them the N-word. People who go ballistic because someone is speaking a language other than English. People who physically attack women because they wear the hijab. A city council candidate in Marysville, Michigan, who is running right now in order to keep Marysville as white as possible. And the list goes on. So why would this be? Political scientists Ashley Jardina and Spencer Piston recently asked a nationally representative sample of white American adults to look at this figure, often called the ascent of man. They asked participants to indicate where white people fall on this continuum, and they asked participants to indicate where black people fall on this continuum. And 38% of white respondents indicated that black people are less evolved than whites. Some by a little, some by a lot. Think about that. You're a black person in this country, and on average, 1/3 of the people, white people you meet believe that you are not fully human, animalistic in some fundamental way. This is true for white people in all economic classes, by the way, so all you overeducated, upper middle class white people here tonight need to stop thinking of racism as primarily a problem of the white working class, because you're just using your classism to mask your racism. Thank you. This was true of people in both political parties as well. Just because you didn't vote for the racist in chief doesn't mean you're off the hook. There was one big political difference, however. 28% of white people who opposed President Trump in 2016 believe black people are less evolved than whites, but 52% of the people who supported President Trump believe black people to be less evolved. Trump supporters' written comments were much more likely to be vicious as well, describing black people. We have racists in every political corner. But the Republican Party has more of them, and more of them who openly embrace white supremacy. The Democrats used to be the party of white supremacy, but that started changing in 1948, when Hubert Humphrey convinced the convention to support civil rights for the first time. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, many Republicans decided they could win elections by appealing to white supremacy, and they did. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush all campaigned and governed using not so subtle appeals to white supremacy. Donald Trump is not the exception among Republican presidents for the last 50 years. Donald Trump is the logical conclusion. The GOP of 2019 is exactly where the Republican Party has been headed since 1964. Which, according to Professor of Law Ian Haney Lopez, was the very last presidential election in which a Democrat received a majority of the white vote. Donald Trump did better than the average Republican presidential candidate with white voters, by the way. He had 58%. I do not say this to encourage anyone to leave the Republican Party. This country needs a conservative party with truly conservative principles, not an authoritarian, xenophobic party that masquerades as conservative. If you are a Republican, please stay right where you are and work for change from the inside. Do us all a favor. Make the Republican Party great again. One more thing about overt out there racism. It's not just us old folk. White millennials are just about as racist as their parents, and young people today are being nurtured in an environment that actively encourages them to embrace white supremacy. White supremacists are online recruiting young white men with a zeal that would shame ISIS. It's happening every place, including Hope College, and I have seen it. Which leads us to the second category of racism, widespread beliefs and assumptions. Held by white people who are not overtly racist, and in fact, probably would describe themselves as not racist. But we've all inhaled the smog of racism, and if we haven't yet worked through that, we're going to be infected by it. A few examples. Eduardo Bonilla Silva, a sociologist at Duke and author of Racism Without Racists, identifies several common assumptions about race shared by many white Americans of all ages. Assumption number one, cultural racism. People and groups of people pretty much end up where they belong. Social structures and personal resources don't matter. If you're poor or you're poorly treated, odds are you're deficient in some way and you brought this on yourself. Naturalism. The way things are is just the way they're supposed to be. It makes sense for white people to be in charge, for neighborhoods to be segregated, for children of color to attend under-resourced schools. It's just natural. Besides, things aren't nearly as bad as people of color and bleeding heart white liberals make them out to be. A little adversity is good for you. And if you just stop playing the victim and do something with your life, things would be fine. These assumptions about race lead as well to assumptions about racial reconciliation. Most white Americans, especially white Christians, believe that the key to racial reconciliation is being nice. And that if you're nice, nothing else matters. Right? As they did under slavery, as they did under Jim Crow, white Christians today, North and South, feel no need to oppose racialization or racism. Most have incorporated it just fine into their worldview and their theology. But they do believe that they should be nice to individual people of color, should they ever run into one. Of course, people with influence have the opportunity to embed racism in the policies they develop, the procedures by which they operate, the laws they enact, the judicial rulings they give. That happens in organizations at all levels, of course. Here are some national examples from the last few years. There's been a significant increase in voter suppression since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Why would they do that? Chief Justice Roberts said it was because racism had ended. Justice Scalia said that the Voting Rights Act was actually not about protecting the right to vote for all citizens, but was instead a racial entitlement. Now, in case you didn't know, a racial entitlement is when people of color are given rights that we all know are supposed to be reserved for white people. Gerrymandering to reduce the voting influence of citizens of color has gone hand in hand with voter suppression. If their votes don't matter, we don't have to bother preventing them from voting. Attempting to add a citizenship question to the federal census for the explicit and well-documented purpose of reducing response rates from people of color. Treating immigrants and asylum seekers, including children, in absolutely inhumane ways, partly, and I believe this, for the sheer joy of it, and partly to gin up the base and make sure their hate is where it needs to be come election day. Finally, category 4, everyday experiences of people of color. The Grow Council of our Center for Diversity and Inclusion is working with other West Michigan colleges to put together a toolkit on everyday microaggressions. It will be available next semester. They're going to offer workshops. I'm sure they will explain many of the racist things people of color have to put up with as they go about their everyday lives. So please be on the lookout for more information from the CDI. Consistent with Ibram Kendi's prediction, as the racist backlash against the civil rights movement has gotten stronger and more visible, and anti-racist backlash against the racist backlash has strengthened too, we see this in a recent Pew Center report called Race in America 2019. White Americans are quite a bit less likely than black Americans to agree that discrimination is an obstacle for black people. Still, just over half of white people do agree, and that's an all-time high. White people are also less likely to believe that black people are discriminated against in specific arenas. But in areas like criminal justice that have been in the news frequently, a majority of white people do believe that discrimination is real. There is a partisan difference, however, with white Democrats far more likely to believe that the nation has not gone far enough to address racism, and white Republicans far less likely to believe that the legacy of slavery still affects the U.S. today. White Republicans are far more likely to believe that too many white people see discrimination where it doesn't exist. White Democrats are far more likely to say too many people don't see discrimination where it does exist. In a few key areas, white Democrats' views mirror those of Americans of color, and that is historically unprecedented. White support for Black Lives Matter is much higher now than white support for Dr. King ever was in the 1960s. Millions of white people who were saying a decade ago that racism is pretty much behind us are now pretty tuned into the fact that racism is strong and getting stronger. Whether this trend continues, and here's the kicker, whether these people can be convinced to attack the racialization that leads to racism, we don't yet know. But with leadership and education, a group this size could make a difference. This is a moment, and we need to take advantage of it. We looked earlier at the role of the church in colonialism. Recall that Professor Willie Jennings said that race in America has a Christian architecture and Christianity in the West has a racial architecture. Author and activist Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove explores the deep connections between the racialized Christianity of colonialism and the racialized Christianity of today, which he says is still a slaveholder religion, deeply embedded in both racialization and racism. Slaveholder religion is a heresy that shapes how we do church and who we do church with. Wilson Hartgrove says it like this: Christianity in America has turned the gospel against itself, tearing in two the people who have adopted slaveholder religion. When white Christians refuse to hear cries for justice from their black and brown sisters and brothers, it is one more symptom of the racism that has long divided our souls, our congregations, and our nation. Our hardness of heart betrays a spiritual sickness that Jesus detected in the Pharisees of his own day. We, like them, have turned the gift of God's law against itself. We turn God's good news into our bad news. The Reverend Dr. William Barber is a North Carolina pastor and author and president of Repairers of the Breach, an anti-racist organization. Early in his ministry, he found that many white Christians offered initial support for his work, but they always disappeared at critical moments. And he asked a white colleague about that, who explained it this way. Here's what you got to understand about white people, the colleague said. At the end of the day, their choice is not whether your cause is just. They've got to decide whether or not their mama lied to them. That's how deeply embedded slaveholder religion is in white Christian upbringing, relationships, worldview, and identity. To accept slaveholder religion is to reject the gospel of Christ. But to reject slaveholder religion is to decide that pretty much everything about your life thus far, including what your mama taught you, is a lie. That's why most white Christians participate comfortably in the racialization of society and the racism that perpetuates it. Jamar Tisby, author of The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, says that when it comes to racism, the church does not have a how-to problem. It has a want-to problem. Naturally, it's easier to be a white racialized Christian, serving a white racialized Jesus, if you worship in a white racialized church. Lutheran pastor and author Joseph Barnt writes this about segregated churches in his book, Becoming the Anti-Racist Church. It is tempting for separate and segregated congregations to have the misguided perception that only multiracial congregations need to be concerned about racism. In fact, the more segregated one's life is, the more imprisoned it is in the church's terrible dilemma of not being able to hear its own message. It is here, in the emptiness and isolation of racial segregation, that racism is doing its greatest damage to the body of Christ. The white racialized church does damage white Christians. It damages Christians of color, too. Professor Seung-Chan Rah of North Park University describes it this way in The Next Evangelicalism, Releasing the Church from Western Cultural Captivity. What he says about evangelicalism, by the way, applies to the entire white church and not just the evangelical portion of it. We must consider how evangelicalism has been held captive to Western white culture and explore the ways that the Christian community can reflect biblical norms more than cultural norms. I grow weary of seeing Western white expressions of the Christian faith being lifted up while failing to see non-white expressions of faith represented in meaningful ways. For example, the consistently poor record of minority faculty hires at Christian colleges and seminaries is not only disappointing, it is irresponsible. If these schools are indeed preparing leaders for the next generation, then for their students to have limited or no exposure to minority faculty mentors is to shortchange their education. Even when a Christian church or college manages to become multicolorful, it often fails to become multicultural. Psychologist and theologian Shaniqua Walker Barnes of Mercer University School of Theology explains it like this. In my experience, most multiracial congregations are far from multicultural. A particular church, and I would add a particular church college, may be diverse in its membership, but still lack true diversity in its leadership, its liturgy and worship, its theology and doctrine, its approaches to mission and discipleship. In some cases, a church can be multiracial, yet culturally homogeneous because all the power and influence in the congregation is held by members of the same cultural group. White people don't see white spaces as segregated, right? We see them as, oh, did we go away? Are you about to help me out? Okay. Yeah, didn't exactly convey confidence there that he was going to do something for me. So. But he's my dean and I love him. Okay. Here we go. Okay. White people don't see white spaces as segregated. We see them as natural and therefore don't understand the harm they cause. Overcoming segregation isn't a nice option for some churches and some church colleges if they happen to feel the call. Overcoming segregation is at the heart of decolonizing the church so that we can live out the truth of the gospel. 50 years ago, James Cone wrote, Christ was not crucified on an altar between two candles. He was crucified on a cross between two thieves. He is not in our peaceful, quiet, comfortable suburban churches, but in the ghetto, fighting the racism of churchly white people. So what can we do now? The answer is remarkably simple and excruciatingly difficult. Because racism arises from racialization, the only way to eliminate racism is to eliminate racialization. It is not about being nice while maintaining white supremacy. It is not about reconciliation talk while maintaining white supremacy. It is not about adding a few more people of color to your organization while maintaining white supremacy. It's about naming and eliminating white supremacy. When the exploitation of racialization is gone, there will be no need for the racism that justifies it. And any other approach is delusional. Opposing racism without dismantling racialization is like trying to lose weight by taking diet pills. Many of us would like to lose weight, like to shed a few pounds, but not if it means exercising more and eating less. And many of us would like for our nation, our school, our church to make racial progress, but not if it means eliminating white supremacy. If you want to lose weight, eat less and exercise more. And if you want to eliminate racism, eliminate racialization. Many people, most recently Ibram Kendi, in his new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, have explained that while most white people hope to be non-racist, it's not possible. We inherited racism. We inhabit racism. We inhaled racism. And if we don't want to be racist, we got to be anti-racist. I have allergies. My immune system releases histamines when it shouldn't. I take meds for that. They are not non-histamines. They're antihistamines. You don't fight histamines with non-histamines. You don't fight racism with non-racism. You want to fight histamines, you take some antihistamines. You want to fight racism, you go with anti-racism. We got to recognize the racism around us and in us and be very intentional about fighting back. Beverly Daniel Tatum, former president of Spelman College and author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, says that the whole society is structured to move us forward to racism, much like the moving sidewalk in an airport. Some people walk ahead on the sidewalk, actively pursuing racism, but even those who simply stand still, the non-racists, are still moving in that direction. You will not begin to address the racism in and around you until you turn around on the sidewalk and walk vigorously in the other direction. Ibram Kendi goes further to say that racist and anti-racist describe our behaviors more than they describe something internal to us. Sometimes we all collaborate with racist systems, and when we do, we are behaving in racist ways. And sometimes some of us fight racist systems, and when we do, we are behaving in anti-racist ways. Ijeoma Oluo, author of So You Want to Talk About Race, said this in a tweet. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fighting racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. So many people of faith, including Christians, including many young, brilliant Christians of color today, have offered guidance on the practical ways we can love God and neighbor in a racist society. But I want us to hear tonight from a prophet for our time, John Perkins, who has talked and written for decades about the 3 R's of working for racial justice. Fundamental to his plan is attacking racialization first so that racism can recede. The first R is redistribution, as in redistribution of wealth, power, and opportunity, not upward for the few, but downward for the many. What would redistribution look like for you? Living more simply so you can spend less of your disposable income on yourself? Advocating for marginalized people at your work? Welcoming marginalized people into your neighborhood? Changing the focus of your charitable giving? Voting for candidates who support downward redistribution? Thinking more intentionally about how and where you volunteer? Asking your church to read a John Perkins book on the 3 R's? The second R is relocation, and Perkins is pretty clear about this. Get out of your segregated upper middle class white spaces and be an intentionally community with an ethnically and economically diverse group of people. Perkins says you've got to move there, live there, like in a house with your family. Not for your neighbor's sake, but for yours. In this culture, getting out of segregated spaces is the only way of getting out of a segregated mindset. The third R is reconciliation. It comes last. After we attack racialization, after we attack segregation, only then do we have the opportunity, and only then do we have the right to live in peace with other people. Simple. Difficult. But the good news of the gospel is that God wants us to respond to God's call even more than we do. God is the Father watching at the road, waiting for our return, ready to kill the fatted calf. The Reverend Dr. Denise Kingdom Greer of Maple Avenue Ministries preached a powerful sermon last summer on Isaiah 65. The chapter begins with God's admonition. I was ready to be sought out by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that did not call on my name. Sound familiar? But the chapter ends with this promise. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. In Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi lays out innumerable ways in which people of color have been oppressed over the last 500 years. It's a brutal look at our brutal history. And yet, he sees a place for hope. No power lasts forever. There will come a time when Americans realize that the only thing wrong with black people is that they think something's wrong with black people. There will come a time when racist ideas will no longer obstruct us from seeing the complete and utter abnormality of racial disparities. There will come a time when we will gain the courage to fight for an equitable society, and maybe, just maybe, that time is now. In the middle of everywhere, Mary Pfeiffer considers the experiences of refugees from other nations who have resettled in her hometown of Lincoln, Nebraska. The bad news is, she says, that racism has scarred the nation for half a millennium. And the good news is that this generation has a chance to do better. At this amazing point in history, Pfeiffer says, we have the opportunity to get things right. So, I appreciate your attendance. Thank you for coming. I'd like to invite our panelists to come to the front and answer your questions.
So, biology, I don't know. I think for me, something that comes to my mind when I hear Jesse talk is the tremendous amount of grief that we carry, right? And the grief and the heaviness that sits with us. I'm Japanese American. My family was interned. It was not my personal experience. It was my mother's experience, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents' experience. But the profound grief that I carry around, knowing that my family was behind barbed wires and interned and living in a horse stable because of somebody else's fear, that's a grief that I will carry with me for my entire life. And I think it's also fair to say that as our students, as Hope College employees, as our students of color, as our colleagues of color experience things on our campus or here in West Michigan, we carry that with us, whether or not it's our own experiences. But what Jesse, for instance, has shared, I carry deeply within myself, and I cannot let that go. I don't just have a desk job that's from 8 to 5, where I can leave something behind. This is a shared reality. It's something that we deeply feel, and it's heavy. And it is. It's a very lonely feeling, even though we can sit up here together and understand what that heaviness means. It's really, really painful. And we can't separate ourselves from that. And frankly, there are sometimes where, as much as I want to, I also don't want to. Because I want to still see that humanity. And I want to know what we do to each other. Because the moment I forget or turn that face away from that, maybe out of self-protection, I feel like I lose a little bit of my humanity.
No, I didn't want to speak too fast in response to that because that was good. And part of what I can't help but think about it from a mental health perspective. I'm a mental health practitioner, and there is research that supports the idea that PTSD is genetic. And there is an article my students read, it's called The Science of Suffering, that talks about this, and it talks about not only just trauma that we know in our day-to-day, like rape and assault and watching the towers fall, but things as far back as slavery and internment and looking at biochemical reactions that happen generations forward. So I think there's a lot of credence to what they're talking about from an emotional perspective that's actually scientifically founded. It's not just a feeling.
So I don't want to be the mama that lies to her kid and has to face it someday. And I was just wondering if the panel could talk about raising anti-racist kids and what the best way to do something like that is, so that my white child that's going to have white supremacist ideas placed in his head at some point, and how do I keep that from getting in there?
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Just
because I have the most kids, doesn't mean. I don't know the right answer to this question. You know, even I have 5 kids, and they're at 4 different schools, and every single one of them is in a classroom as the only black child. And one of them's in high school and one of them's in middle school, so they're switching classes and still have that experience. So even raising black children in Holland, that's a question I ask myself of how do I foster racial identity in my children? How do I expose them to people that look like them and can support their views? I was just talking to a friend who's in this room about this the other night. And I don't even know. I mean, we're looking at houses even to move to a more diverse area. I don't know what the answer is. But I think for us, it's a constant intentionality of, you know, we live on the north side, but when we play rec sports, we do it on the south side. When we go to church, we, you know, are members at a church that's not diverse, and we more often frequent Maple Ave, where Kingdom Greer spoke, because there are people that look like my kids. And I think part of that is not just the responsibility of me raising black kids, but how do you, raising white kids, make decisions around that? We've lived in Holland, this is our 7th year. My 17-year-old's been invited to spend the night at his friend's house once. And what's that about? Even though people would say he's popular. So I think there is an intentionality that has to happen beyond just saying and doing the right things in your day-to-day walk.
I have the answer. I had to think about it for a while, and you reminded me of the answer. In many ways, there's a lot of really good social activists in here, a lot of social activism, a lot of really wonderful programs that puts people together and stuff like that. But I have the answer, and it's what I do for a living. Books. Books. And it might not seem that way. You're like, it's just a book. No, it's not a book. It's a whole world. It's a whole world where somebody gets to experience and imagine a better world a lot of times. A world where people get along together, a world where people don't get hurt, or where people help each other out. Those are picture books, and there's a lot of them. There are a lot of other books, middle school books, young adult books that help somebody see through the eyes of another person, has them imagine what that person goes through. And if after reading something and after imagining the world through somebody else's eyes, you're not changed in some kind of way, then either 1, you're a bad reader, or 2, something went wrong. Because that is a powerful, powerful thing. It is, literature changes the way we think about everything. And so, like I said, what I do for a living is I read books, and I write about books. And I teach books. And it's quite an easy job, actually. But they're powerful, powerful, powerful instruments where somebody can imagine the world through somebody else's eyes. And that is an amazing, amazing experience. And I wish more people could read more books, and people would open themselves up to picking up picture books and reading them, like really just reading them. There's some really fabulous, beautiful ones out there. And no, they just look like picture books, and you think like, oh, only a 6-year-old is supposed to read this. Like, no. You read it, you find some meaning in it. Same thing for young adult novels, which is what I write on. They're wonderful, wonderful opportunities to share in somebody else's life for a given amount of time, and it will change your life and the way you think about things. So books.
We have time for one more question. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Kasey, did I cut you off?
Here, I will be brief so that we can hear one more question and respond. I think in addition to, I will affirm books, certainly. I think some of the students that have been the most empathetic students, especially white empathetic students, I've asked them about that, and they've often referenced, my mom put books of diverse people in front of me when I was younger. And I will second that by saying you, like doing work on you, right? And reconciling with some of those things and undoing some of those things. And I don't know, my kid's not even 3, so I don't know how we're going to approach some of this, right? But as a marginally white presenting person married to a biracial person myself, married to a white person, and I have a child who looks much more like Leonardo DiCaprio than Denzel. The reality is, though, that he's going to go to people's homes and they're not going to know who I am or my story. And if you aren't doing the work on yourself away from people of color, you're going to do things to harm my kid when he's in your presence because you'll have no idea, right? And so doing that work in yourself is probably, I think, one of the biggest things that comes to mind.
Bria, you get the last one.
My question was, I feel like a lot of people of color here at Hope feel ostracized, particularly for numerous reasons, and one being not having a prominent amount of people of color in faculty and in administration, who we can go to and who we can confide in, but also not having people of color who we can learn from. And so I have two questions, and one is, how, Professor Green, how is it being a white male and teaching a class that, like, you probably have never first-handedly experienced? And also for the people up here, is how is it being a minority at Hope College, a minority professor, and how can we as a Hope College community help people of color find a sense of, like, I can take this class, I can trust this professor because I know from experience that they're gonna help me, they're gonna be for me just because of the color of their skin. And often we feel like antagonized because we don't really know how to go about, for example, having a white professor or having someone who teaches these things that we experience every day, and sort of the difference between empathizing and sympathizing, and how do we navigate through that? I hope.
Yeah, you need to go into teaching too. I'm going to just say very briefly that Bria's pointed out that I am the nerdiest white guy she's ever met. but I'm going to expand on what Amy Otis talked about, right? And that you can feel the stories of people you love. I think that's what makes a difference. You got to love some people. You got to love some people. You got to be in a relationship with people. You got to know how terrific they are, and you got to be there when they're struggling. So I think from that's one thing, Bria, from a white perspective.
It's both that easy and not that easy. I think that Hope, how to say it, it sometimes looks intentional. The number of faculty we have, Latinx faculty, I think we're down to a handful, literally. Like I'm not. That's not a metaphor. And that almost looks intentional sometimes, willful, if nothing else. So it's that easy, and it's also not that easy. I will say this to you, and I mean it, and I'll support you on this if you ever need it. There are a lot of professors who are really, really good and are welcoming, loving, and you can trust them with your lives. And they cross all different kinds, gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, where they're from, their experiences. And I think that it's hard searching them because you have to trust them sometimes. But I will support you in this, that if a professor ever says something, and being a faculty of color does not mean, by the way, that you don't say stupid things. I've done my share, believe me. So it doesn't mean you stop saying stupid things. But if a professor ever says something and you wish to call them on it, go talk to them. Say what you feel. Mean it. And it'll be a liberating point for you. Because in that moment, when you are teaching a professor, you will have reversed a dynamic, right? You have reversed the teacher-student dynamic where you are now teaching that person. And it's a liberating point. It's a scary point. But it's also a liberating point. And it's also a reality. And so, like I said, it's not that easy. It's both that easy and not that easy. And I wish you luck, because it's not that easy and it's that easy.
I'm going to take my cues from one of my mentors and somebody I tremendously look up to, Chuck. And I want to be brutally honest, the way you have been tonight. Being at Hope as a faculty and staff of color is not an easy place to be. In part because we see a lot of our colleagues leave. The relationships that have been built, even amongst us as colleagues, as resources for the students, we grieve again the loss when people leave. And they leave for a variety of reasons. But we also know, and this is the honest part, that this is an incredibly difficult place to be as a faculty and staff of color, just like for our students, right? And so we have our work cut out for ourselves. I think that also means that we need to be incredibly honest about the type of institution that we are. Yeah? And I think we can start. It's never too late, but we have to be honest about where we are, and we also have to be willing to change our culture around here, right? We can bring more people of color in, but if fundamentally we do not change our environment where people can thrive, regardless of being students, faculty, or staff, it will continue this whole cycle of people leaving and moving in and out. It's not that our white colleagues are not able to meet the needs, because, as Jesse said, there are people across the board who will sit and be present with students. There's no doubt about that. But there is something to be said about seeing the representation. It's also for me to look at the administration as a staff member, right? And to say, where is my representation, that I can be encouraged to know that somebody's got my back? It's questions that we ask as faculty, as staff, and as students. And we have the ability to make a change here at Hope if we are willing to change our culture and our space and understand what it means to have the space where everyone can thrive. We have a strategic plan. We have, I think, a president who is going to lead us into some of this. I think we really have cause to be hope. We can make a difference here. But we do it collectively, and we have to be honest and truthful. We cannot pretend things are always good. We have to be clear about where we are as an institution and decide if we're going to move forward or decide if we're just going to stay here. And then if we're just going to stay here, then I think we all have the choice to be able to say, then maybe we need to leave, right? Or maybe I am going to be present so I can be that person for a student who's trying to figure this out. But that's then the choice that we have, right? So let's start by being honest as an institution and not being afraid of speaking into the spaces where we need to have some changes.